Hello everyone, you're listening to Alternative Revelations with Linda Emmanuel. And today's podcast, number 17, is all about chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and also I'm going to go into gout and explain why a mycoplasma infection can cause gout. And before I get started, I have to say this disclaimer that I am not a doctor, nor am I a licensed practitioner. Therefore, I cannot give a medical advice, and these podcasts are for informational purposes only. And with that said and done, I can begin the podcast. So when I first meet somebody that's sick and they don't know what is causing their illness, I start asking them questions. Can you sleep? Are you depressed? Are you always cold or hot? Have you lost your libido? These are telltale signs of a mycoplasma infection. And I'm going to go over what mycoplasma is again. It is the most common cause of cancer and disease. And one of the things that needs to replicate is fat, or in other words, cholesterol. And our body is pretty much made of fat and water. And the cell membrane, or our cell wall, is 80% fat, and the brain is 75% fat. So mycoplasma can invade the endocrine system, and I'm going to do a whole detailed podcast on the endocrine system, how mycoplasma can wreak havoc on the endocrine system where you make hormones. So getting back to mycoplasma. Mycoplasma has been around forever, and it is a cell wall deficient bacterium that causes disease, and it lives in an anaerobic environment, which means no oxygen. In fact, oxygen kills it. It is only the nucleus of a bacteria, and it has no organelles of its own to manufacture energy. So it totally is a parasite. It needs a host to furnish it material for it to replicate, and it also thrives on sugar. Now, mycoplasma is also a bioweapon our own government unleashed on us in the 70s and 80s, and if it was not for Donald W. Scott and crusaders like Dr. Harold Clark and Dr. Garth Nicholson, maybe the world might never have found out about it. But now people are finding out about it. And I guess they have a right to be angry because so many people are sick. And one of the things mycoplasma attacks is genetic weaknesses, genetically weak tissues. And we all are genetically different as far as weaknesses. We each inherit both parents' genetic weaknesses and are actually degenerative cells. In my family, for instance, we have a degenerative macula, which causes macular degeneration. And that was in the very last podcast. I explained all about macular degeneration. And in some families, maybe diabetes runs in their family. In some families, the women get endometriosis. And again, mycoplasma needs fat. And endometriosis, it actually attacks the lining, the sac that encases the female reproductive organs. Mycoplasma is also the tiniest living organism, even smaller than a virus. And in the last podcast, I did mention that scientists have got it confused with a virus, and they have named it a retrovirus. So again, if you ever see the word retrovirus, you know it's mycoplasma. And a lot of people get coconut oil confused with viruses, saying that coconut oil kills viruses, but I really do think that is untrue, because when they read the research and they see that it kills retroviruses, so they assume it kills all viruses. And in my opinion, coconut oil only kills mycoplasma because mycoplasma needs fat for its membrane, and it uptakes the coconut oil, and that is medium chain fatty acids, which it cannot use, and it dissolves its membrane. And viruses are not encased in membrane, they are encased in protein. So for instance, I'll give you an example. A family passes mycoplasma infection back and forth. Now the husband may get diabetes and the wife may get breast cancer, as in the case of Tom Hanks and his wife Rita. He has diabetes and she has breast cancer. So they're genetically different as far as weaknesses. Now their children, if they have any children and they get sick, they may get diabetes and they got the genetic weakness from their father, Tom Hanks. And then they may also, if it is a female child, she may develop breast cancer later on in her life. Again, the children inherit both parents' genetic weaknesses that they inherited from their ancestors. I have a good example of a family. The mother had endometriosis, and her daughter was both bipolar and also had endometriosis. So she inherited the weakness of endometriosis probably from her mother. So if you're wondering, you have a mycoplasma infection, and usually doctors cannot tell you what is by your symptoms. They are clueless. You could get every blood test in the book and they will not come up with mycoplasma. To me, this is very frustrating when doctors cannot tell you what is causing your symptoms. For instance, I had huge, dark, bloody granulomas under my armpits that were like the plague, and they were full of, I'm sorry to say this, pus and blood. And when they burst, it was very painful. It reminded me of the plague. Yet one doctor said, for an explanation of these, he said, change your deodorant. And another doctor said, ingrown hair. If that isn't crazy, I haven't heard anything as crazy as that. These doctors don't use common sense. So I have talked to many people after they've listened to my podcasts and radio shows, and they said their doctor could not tell them what was wrong, and they were stumped. And one man had 24 vials of blood taken from him, and they still didn't know what was wrong. Until he heard my show, then he knew what was going on. He knew he had a mycoplasma infection. In fact, his brother had listened to a show where I talked about the subject, is it safe for you to stop smoking? And Josh had just quit smoking, and right after he quit smoking, he got sick. And again, he's the one that had 24 vials of blood taken from him, and they still didn't know what was wrong. And to tell you the truth, I sent Josh 3 bottles of mild silver protein. And Josh, if you're listening to this podcast, give me a call how it's working and seeing how you're doing. And Josh also is probably on the ketogenic diet, which is a sugar-free diet. So I expect him to get well. I hope he can come on the show sometime and talk about his experience. And this is also important. Mycoplasma infections are spread through body fluids, sharing body fluids with an infected person. This means either through sex, kissing, or sharing body fluids. Even eating off the same plate, a person can get infected. So if you do have a mycoplasma infection and have children, and you don't want your children to get sick, be very careful about giving them any body fluids until you are well. And also, if your spouse is sick, they are passing you the organism. So you have to, both of you need to, I shouldn't give advice here, but both people need to go on a ketogenic diet and assume that you both have the mycoplasma infection. And if your spouse isn't sick yet, it takes a trauma to activate a mycoplasma infection. And it is laying dormant in a degenerative cell waiting to activate. And what is interesting is you always hear about a spouse who nurses their other spouse or their husband or wife who is dying of cancer. And how often do you hear that the other spouse who was the nurse dies within a year of their spouse dying? And this is because the trauma of the spouse dying and also the stressful care of that patient brings on a mycoplasma infection in them, and they too die of it, but they might not die of the same disease or the same symptoms. This is also a true story. Another person that listened to my podcast, and I won't mention names, but he had listened to a radio show, and he was married, and he found out his wife was cheating on him. And now this was a trauma, and she got infected from cheating on him, and she got him infected. So I'm hoping that he's doing well, that he's getting himself well. He and his wife had reconciled, and they're both trying to get well. So that's the ending to a happy story. I hope they're doing well. I hope he contacts me and tells me how he is doing. I also sent him bottles of mild silver protein, which I hope helped. And thankfully, both these people have the knowledge now and the information on how to get well, how to kill mycoplasma, which it makes me feel really good, warm and fuzzy inside when I help people, because there's nothing worse than being sick. So I tell people, you either have to be celibate or monogamous, but I guess if you're monogamous and your spouse cheats on you, you can get an infection. So people out there, we really need to clean up our act about sharing body fluids with strangers. This is why we are in such an epidemic, between riding on airplanes where people are sick and sharing body fluids with infected people. That's why we're in such a state we are. That's why there is an epidemic of cancer and disease. And people have not put it together yet, because not every single person gets the same symptoms. Somebody may get diabetes, somebody may get liver cancer, somebody else may get colon cancer, somebody else may get leukemia, somebody else may get psoriasis, somebody else may get Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's, or lupus, or rheumatoid arthritis. They're all the same infections, just different places in the body. So if you're really concerned about staying healthy, do not share body fluids with infected people. This is spreading the disease. And there is nothing wrong with sharing body fluids with your spouse or your loved one, but it is really dangerous to bed hop. So the following, I'm going to give you a list, are the typical symptoms of a mycoplasma infection where it presents as cancer or disease. Number 1, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, chronic headaches, and bouts of nausea. Hypersensitivity to temperature and barometric pressure changes. Cognitive problems, brain fog. Short-term memory loss. Emotional imbalance, meaning bipolar or depression. Endocrine system hormonal imbalance, reproductive system problems, infertility, which may include loss of libido, endometriosis, and spontaneous abortion. Granulomas under the armpits, what I just mentioned. Frequent bouts of generalized pain, which I suffered. Reduce blood volume, and that is also hormonal. And gout, but not in all cases, because you can get gout like Henry VIII ate too much meat or liver and kidneys, and that is a lot of nucleic acid, which I will explain in this podcast about gout. I would say the majority of doctors cannot explain fibromyalgia, but according to researchers, mycoplasma can exist in an inert, inactive form called a crystal, or they can convert to a liquid state under certain conditions of pressure, temperature, and pH. And usually the crystallized mycoplasma has points in the body where it settles, and this is what people who have fibromyalgia are experiencing, the crystallized mycoplasma. And this is not according to Linda, this is according to scientific research findings. And again, I was sick myself with mycoplasma. I experienced brain fog. I experienced chronic fatigue. I experienced severe depression. I was always so cold that I'd have to blow a hairdryer on my belly. That's how cold I was always, so cold. So it does wreak havoc in the endocrine system where you make hormones. And usually with a mycoplasma infection, you experience low-grade fevers at night, and you might wake up in your bed with the bed soaking wet. This happened to me many, many times. I had to get up and I was so sick, yet I had to change the sheets because it was in the winter time and I couldn't sleep on cold, wet sheets. It was a miserable experience. And if you watched Dr. Molden's or listened to Dr. Molden's episode about vaccines, mycoplasma likes sludgy, still blood, and it usually causes damage in the feet and the fingers. You get neuropathy, nerve damage. This is probably because mycoplasma resides in places where the blood is not flowing, and those are the farthest away from the heart, where the blood is exchanging, going from arteries to veins, coming back to the heart. And this is why people are getting neuropathy in their hands and their feet. And also, for your information, mycoplasma causes carpal tunnel. It attacks the myelin sheath in the wrist. And many people who have a mycoplasma infection are experiencing chronic fatigue. And the following explains chronic fatigue and why and how it happens in a mycoplasma infection. And this is not Linda's version. This comes straight from the researchers, scientific researchers, who have proved that this happens. And it goes as follows. First of all, the mycoplasma invade the cell, and the cell is helpless on the inside. The immune system is on the outside, and when the mycoplasma goes to work, it starts taking apart the cell, and eventually the cell dies. Now, the contents of the cell and the mycoplasma are released from the ruptured cell when it dies, and they hit the bloodstream, the replicated mycoplasma, along with the contents of the cell. And one of the contents of the cell is a amino acid called glutamate, and you might have heard of this from monosodium glutamate. Well, glutamate is an excitotoxin. It is used for cells to communicate among themselves. But when it hits the bloodstream, the body cannot tolerate glutamate. Again, glutamate is an excitotoxin and causes nerve cells to fire. When glutamate is outside the cell, this triggers a chemical reaction. The body must turn glutamate into glutamine, and they are in the same family. The process to turn glutamate into glutamine is as follows, and I'm going to quote this from my book. To convert glutamate into glutamine, the body takes an ammonia ion off of urea in the bloodstream, causing the release of a cyanide ion. The cyanide ion then enters a neighboring cell where it focuses on the battery of that cell, which is the mitochondria. Now, at the fourth complex of the mitochondria's Krebs cycle, the cyanide uptakes the energy generated. This deprives the cell of its energy and results in the temporary shutdown of that cell, resulting in chronic fatigue. Now, the cyanide does not kill the cell. According to researchers, the red blood cells neutralize cyanide and carry it off, where it is excreted from the body. Now, much of what I have learned about mycoplasma is from the Common Cause Medical Research Foundation's journals. And if not for the courageous work of its founder, Donald W. Scott, who died on December 6th of 2011, this world would be in a much darker place to live. Now, I owe my health and my life to both Dr. Harold Clark and Donald W. Scott. So to sum it up, when the mitochondria is breaking down molecules to make fuel, our energy. The cyanide uptakes the energy in the fourth cycle of the Krebs cycle, and it deprives the cell of energy. Therefore, the cell, or you experience chronic fatigue. But this is temporary. Now, this makes me wonder about people who have Alzheimer's. That's a big mystery for me, and maybe you too. But many times, people who have Alzheimer's, they give you a far-off stare like they're in some other world. Now, it makes me wonder if this is caused from a cyanide entering a brain cell or the nerve cell and shutting down that nerve cell, and maybe this is what gives people that blank stare. But of course, I'll never find out because researchers aren't interested in learning about mycoplasma. They're only interested, or scientists are only interested in creating more drugs. Now, why I mentioned this is some days people who have Alzheimer's, they give you that far-off stare, but yet the next day they're a different person. They may be alert. So this is why I think that the cyanide is shutting down the nerve cells in the brain. So now we're going to get into how mycoplasma can cause gout. And I'm going to quote you a part of a book called The Brucellosis Triangle on page 71, which was written by Donald W. Scott. And I quote here, "Gout is caused by an excess of uric acid crystals, usually found in the joint of the big toe. The excess uric acid may be due to the digestion of rich foods in nucleic acids such as liver and kidneys. This is the high living disease associated with Henry VIII. Or the excess of uric acid may be due to the breakdown of nucleic acids in the body cells." Now, mycoplasma themselves within selected cells and in the process liberate the damaged cell's nucleic acid. When the released nucleic acid breaks down into uric acid, it forms into crystals which cause the pain of gout and arthritis. Further, when uric acid crystallizes and is deposited in certain muscle masses and joints, this produces excruciating pain associated with fibromyalgia. Now, this is interesting. This is mycoplasma and kidney failure. When the nucleic acid from the dead cells is released into the bloodstream, the body turns these nucleic acids into uric acid. These in turn crystallize, and when the kidneys cannot handle the volume of the uric acid, hyperuricemia occurs. This could lead to kidney stones. Further, uric acid crystals can obstruct the kidney's tubules, leading to kidney failure and death. Now, my father suffered from Parkinson's for 20 years. He had chronic urinary tract infections, which are mycoplasma. Now, my father, he didn't die of Parkinson's. He died from kidney failure. And the failure was caused from the crystallized uric acid. His kidneys shut down and he died. And when I wasn't driving a couple years ago, I was taking call a ride in St. Louis, and the bus drivers are very intelligent guys, and we were talking about mycoplasma, and they said, "Oh my gosh, you would not believe all the people we take to kidney dialysis. It has really jumped in the past years." And in my own opinion, this is from mycoplasma. Mycoplasma can shut down the kidneys. It's that simple. Kidney failure is from a lot of cell death going on in the body, and the cells are releasing nucleic acid, and the body turns it into uric acid, and too much uric acid can block the kidneys and you get kidney failure. And it can lead to death. So again, mycoplasma infections lead to a slow, painful death, especially with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So that concludes podcast number 17, all about chronic fatigue, symptoms of a mycoplasma infection, gout, and a little bit about hormonal imbalance. And the next podcast, number 18, will be about anemia, all about anemia and how mycoplasma causes anemia. When people have a chronic mycoplasma infection, they usually have anemia, and you're going to find out how it all works, how it happens. I have been researching mycoplasma for the last 16 years, and I just am so happy that you're listening to this podcast, that I can share information with you, and if I can help you or give you information how you can protect yourself from cancer and disease, or even to get well, that makes my day. So if you have show comments or want to have a topic discussed on the next podcast or upcoming podcast, drop me an email. I'll put my email address in the description. And I would like to hear stories. I would like to hear people. I'd like to hear happy endings, because I've had a happy ending. I got well. In fact, I had mycoplasma infection 2 or 3 times, and I overcame it each time on my own, except, the first time I had the IVs, I had help. But if I can help anybody get well by sharing information, that's my job. That's why I'm doing these podcasts. So, until next time, good night and God bless.